The geographic area of the Aegean consists of the mainland of Greece, the island of Crete, and the Cycladic islands found in the Aegean Sea to the east of the mainland of Greece. Humans have inhabited this area since as early as the late Paleolithic era. The Aegean civilizations of the Minoans and the Mycenaeans developed at the same time as those of Mesopotamia and Egypt. They were aware of Mesopotamian and Egyptian cultures and somewhat influenced by them. They are considered the forerunners to the later Greek civilization and are sometimes called the prehistoric period in Greek art. The first culture we will look at are the ancient Minoans, located on the island of Crete and its surrounding islands. We tend to lump all of these cultures together, but really most were separate civilizations separated by miles of sea. We can connect them, though, by a consistent artistic style, which we loosely call Minoan. The Minoans celebrated life and nature in their art. Their potters had use of the potter's wheel, which made for better quality pottery with curvilinear, natural, organic, polychromatic designs. Their paintings were loose, irregular, curvilinear, and figures were nude and youthful. Art was a celebration of everyday life and nature. The geography of the sea was very important to these cultures. They lived in a mild, wet climate with plenty of natural defense and abundant trade opportunities. The Minoans were not fearful of attack, so rather than building tombs, temples, or forts, they built monumental palaces like this one at Knossos. Knossos was well advanced for its time in terms of architecture. Built with thick walls, it was a multi-story structure with sophisticated indoor plumbing made of terracotta pipes. It also contained wooden columns similar to those of the later Greeks. It was built of rubble and ashlar, stone, and mortar. Also, all along the palace were mansions and villas of aristocrats or court officials. The term labyrinth actually comes from this palace. Labyrinth means double axe in Greek, which is a recurring motif found throughout the palace, referring to the sacrificial slaughter. The labyrinth was the house of the double axes. For Knossos, the interiors were richly painted in fresco. These were done in a wet fresco process where you paint on wet lime plaster. As the plaster dries, the painting becomes a permanent part of the plaster and therefore the wall. Compared to the dry fresco secco the Egyptians used, the wet fresco allows for a more lively, impressionistic feeling. In each case, the technique goes along with the subject matter. These frescoes depict many aspects of Cretan life, including bullfights, processions, ceremonies, and images of plants and animals native to the area, especially those of the sea. Minoan painting can be characterized as loose, irregular, and curvilinear. Figures are often nude, youthful, and doing activities of either everyday life or celebrating life. In this fresco, we see a bull leaping game or ritual. This was a common game or leisure activity. Using the traditional Minoan figure, it depicts how the matador would grab the bull by the horns, somersault onto his back, and then flip to the ground. In the painting, the shape of the bull's back is elongated to emphasize motion. Notice that the figure is youthful, long-legged, narrow-waisted, and has long hair. Did you guys notice that women are painted as white-skinned and men are red-skinned? This was also common in Egyptian painting. Here's a drawing of how one archaeologist thinks this game would have been played. Notice that the girls are also bull leaping. Cretan potters made use of the potter's wheel, allowing for a more smooth shape and even thickness. Their pottery was decorated with a polychromatic style. Kamaras ware is named for the cave on the slope of the mountain where they were first discovered. The octopus face is a great example of Kamaras ware, natural marine life organically flowing all over the curves of the vase. Next, we will look at the Mycenaeans. The poet Homer wrote about the Aegean world in the Iliad. His account has always been credited with being great poetry, but not as historical fact. The German archaeologist Heinrich Schielmann used Homer as a guide and found the ancient cities of Troy, Mycenae, Tiryns, and confirming that Homer was more than just mythology. There is some historical basis for his work. Unlike Crete, the Mycenaeans needed fortified walls to protect their cities. This is called Cyclopean architecture because legend has it that only a cyclops could lift the heavy stones used in the construction. As with any walled city, gates become a focal point. Here you have the Lion Gate showing two protective lions worshipping a Minoan-style column. The Mycenaeans used the corbelled arch throughout their construction. The corbelled arch is created by placing each stone slightly farther out until the two sides meet in the middle, called cantilever construction. A capstone or a keystone is put on top, and that pressure is what holds the whole thing together. Mycenaean art is often funerary in nature. In addition to their fortifications, the Mycenaeans were known for their tombs. Mycenaeans, like most cultures, buried their dead outside the city walls. The so-called treasury of Atreus was probably built about the time of the Trojan War. The treasury of Atreus found at Mycenae was a beehive tomb from mythology said to have housed the treasures of Atreus, the father of Agamemnon. When Schielman discovered these beehive tombs, he found the men buried with gold cups and weapons and the women with their jewelry. All faces were covered with gold masks. Mycenaean metalwork includes a life-size beaten gold mask and bronze dagger blades with scenes of hunters and animals inlaid in gold, silver, and yellow, a black metal mix of copper, silver, and lead. These objects were found in the tomb, similar to what we looked at with the ancient Egyptians. Originally thought to be King Agamemnon, which is what Schielman was hoping for, but Agamemnon would have lived about 300 years after this if he was real, from the Iliad. It is made of repoussé. Repoussé is a method of beating metal to create a three-dimensional shape. This mask is made of beaten gold. It is not known if it was a portrait of the dead, but masks were found showing people of all ages and physical descriptions. This one is of an older bearded man. Notice that his eyes are closed. This is very different from the Egyptians, whose death masks were seen with open eyes. This probably signifies a difference in their understanding of death and the afterlife. These objects attested to the wealth of these kings as well as their warlike nature. Note that the figures are in Minoan style, thin waists, etc., but the subject matter is clearly Mycenaean. Man began to play a new and important role in art. The Greek philosopher Protagoras said that man is the measure of all things. The Greeks felt that man's intelligence is what sets us apart. This was a time of great intellectual development, including the great philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle, great teachers like Socrates, and great tragic dramatists such as Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. The Greeks extended their ideas about man into their religion. The Greek gods were created in the image of man, having man's character and weaknesses, with the only difference being that they were immortal. The Greeks felt that man should strive for perfection of both body and mind. The philosophy that characterized these ideas about man was called humanism. Humanism is a philosophy characterized by concern for human values and interests, distinct from, but not opposed to, otherworldly values of religion. So not surprising, the human body was the key subject in Greek art. Politically, Greece was organized into independent city-states called a polis. These polis were never able to unify and frequently battled among themselves. After a common pattern of political development, each polis eventually adopted a democratic form of government. Democracy, or rule by the people, was a Greek invention. Greek history begins in 776 BC with the first Olympic Games. Each polis participated, and while the government of each polis remained separate, from here on, the Greek language unites them. They came to regard themselves as Hellenes, anyone who speaks Greek, with all non-Greek speaking people being called barbarians. They thought of themselves as better, more smart, and more clever than anyone else. One characteristic of Greek culture and art that is different from the other cultures to this point is that once established, their culture did not just stay the same, but gradually developed and changed. Greek ideas and art were strongly influenced by the Mesopotamians and Egyptians. The Greeks took those ideas, filtered them, experimented with them, and improved on them. However, in their quest for perfection, Greek culture was not perfect. They believed in slavery, and women were excluded from public life. The Proto-Geometric period is from 1000 to 900 BC. They were strongly influenced by Aegean pottery. This period coincides with the end of the Aegean Dark Ages. The geometric or the orientalizing period is from 900 to 600 BC. Greek vase painting becomes very geometric in design and shows influences of Mesopotamian and Egyptian art. The first human form appears in Greek art during this period. Vase painting was the only form of art that survived the Aegean Dark Ages. This was the early Greeks' link to the past. The earliest vases created during the Proto-Geometric period were very similar both visually and in content to that of the earlier Aegean civilizations. During geometric period, the vase painting began to develop and include purely Greek innovations. It also contains the first images of man and narrative seen in the art of this region in almost 400 years. This vase was created as a grave marker, and on the shoulder of the vase contains a funeral narrative. The bottom of the crater is open, perhaps to let mourners pour libations on the grave. During the geometric period, vase painting began to develop and included purely Greek innovations. It also contains the first images of man and narrative seen in the art of the religion region in almost 400 years. This vase was created as a grave marker. On the shoulder of the vase contains a funeral narrative. The bottom of the crater is open, perhaps to let mourners pour libations on the grave. This vase is actually about 3 feet high. The figures are seen placed in a shroud over the dead and mourning by pulling on their hair. Each of these figures is made up primarily of geometric shapes. These figures are stylized and repetitive, much like the repetitive forces on the Mesopotamian standard of Ur. The biggest source of Greek pottery we have is Etruscan tombs. Pottery is now signed by the painter and a potter. For example, a pot will have so-and-so painted me and so-and-so made me. Subject matter is Greek mythology and drunkenness. There are 2 types of decoration. The black figure technique started with a vase made of red clay. The figures were painted with slip, a mixture of clay and water. When the painted vase was fired at a high temperature, the slip turned black. Details such as thin lines were scratched away from the painting area with a sharp tool. In this process, only the figure was painted. The background was left the natural red color of the clay. Here we have Achilles and Ajax playing dice. He was the master of the black figure technique. Ezekias was the painter and potter for this piece, but that's not always the same person, remember. This piece was found in an Etruscan tomb at Volcae. Surface is not divided into horizontal bands as we have seen previously in the Diplon crater we just looked at. Instead, one wide band of figures is on the belly of the pot. Here we have Achilles and Ajax playing a game of dice. Out of their mouths come words written, 4 and 3. Both are holding spears and fully armored as if waiting for action. Notice the composition, spears angling down to the table where the 2 figures are also staring. The remarkable part is in the detailing of the figures' cloaks. This was done by scraping away. You had to know exactly what you wanted before because once you scraped, you can't put it back on. The red figure technique developed from a desire to avoid the scraping process of the black figure technique. The red figure technique was essentially the opposite process. Rather than painting the figure, the background was painted. The figure was left the natural red color of the clay. Only fine details in the figure were painted. It was much easier to paint these details than to scrape them away, as was necessitated in the black figure process. To reiterate, only the background was painted and no scraping occurred, and then the white ground technique, in which the whole surface is covered with a white slip, and then the details, the background and the figures are all painted on, was developed later. Sculpture went through the same gradual process of development as vase painting did, however, less survives. Much of what we know about Greek sculpture comes from Roman copies. The primary subject of these sculptures was the human body, especially the male nude. The sculptures of the geometric period were not monumental. These small sculptures were often portable. They were stylized with body parts made of simple shapes and sometimes included a decorative geometric pattern on clothing. The fact that many of the males are seen nude suggests the development of the early Greek appreciation of the human body. Influences can be seen of the Aegean, Egyptian, and Mesopotamian cultures in many of the figures. The Mesopotamian influence is called Orientalizing. The Greeks built modest homes and no palaces, but were known as great temple builders. Greek architecture developed from Aegean temple plans. These temples were designed to house statues of the gods and goddesses. Sculpture plays an important role in Greek architecture. Not only were these temples ornamented with sculpture, but the temples themselves were considered to be a type of sculpture. The same desire for perfection that was applied to figure sculpture was applied to architecture. Temples were placed on a hill above each city called an acropolis. The acropolis is the hill above the city of Athens. Temples were placed on an acropolis so they could be seen by all and given the proper respect. The temples were built using the basic post and lintel style of architecture. Many of the earliest Greek temples do not survive because they were made of wood, and we will not see the construction mimicked in the stone version. The plan and elevation of Greek temples varied with date, geography, and the requirements for the individual projects, but all canonical Greek temples have common defining elements that set them apart from other religious buildings, as well as from other Greek buildings. The cella or the naos, this was the temple core, a room with no windows and no doors, usually housing the cult statue of the deity. The pronaos or the porch was the entryway porch with 2 columns in antis or between walls. Many elements of the design were purely decorative for balance and symmetry. The Greeks developed 3 styles of architecture called orders. These orders are the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders. The Doric order developed on the mainland of Greece during the Archaic period. It was the first and simplest, plainest order to develop. The columns were short and wide with no base. The capital is a simple cushion or a bulb shape. The frieze of the Doric order is divided into two areas called triglyphs and metopes. Triglyphs are fluted areas that look much like the shaft of the column. They separated the metopes from one another. Metopes were areas left open for sculpture. The Ionic order was the second to develop, also during the Archaic period. The columns were taller and thinner than the Doric order and have a decorative base between the shaft and the stylobate. The capital in this order is a scroll shape called a volute. The frieze is left open and usually filled with a continuous band of sculpture. It was not divided as in the Doric order. One other characteristic sometimes found in the Ionic order was that they would substitute female sculptures as columns. These female sculptures were called caryatids. The Corinthian order was the last to develop, and the columns were much thinner and taller than the previous two orders. The capital was made of a delicate acanthus leaves. The Greeks didn't build big palaces because they had no reigning monarchs, and their domestic buildings were very plain. They were industrious builders, however, and put their building energy into temple building. They actually performed their religious rites outside, and they didn't go inside the temple to worship the deity. The altar was outside the temple at the east, where the sun rises. The temple itself housed a votive offering to the deity, the cult statue. It was the house of the deity, not for the followers. Both the Doric and Ionic orders developed during the Archaic period. The Temple of Hera I at Paestum was a massive Doric structure. There is another Temple of Hera nearby, which is not as old. The columns are heavy and short. They were spaced close together for fear of not being able to support the entablature. Notice the swelling at the center of the column. This swelling was called entasis. Unfortunately, most of the entablature, including the frieze, pediment, and all of the roof, has vanished. If they were, it would look even more squashed. Greek schemed remarkable order, compactness, and symmetry reflect the Greeks' sense of proportion and their effort to achieve ideal forms in terms of regular numerical relationships with geometric rules. The simple core elements remain the same no matter how complex or how they are elaborated on. Only in the archaic temples we find a central flow of columns that divides the cella into two aisles. Aim was to support the roof. However, it resulted in no place to put the cult statue and an uneven number of columns on the end, which meant no central doorway. Greek sculpture. Two types of figures developed during the Archaic period, the kouros and the kore. The kouros was a nude male between the ages of 18 and 21, standing with one leg forward. This position was borrowed from the Egyptians and had the same stiff approach. Although they borrowed the stiff striding position of the Egyptians, the Greeks added a smile to the face of the archaic sculptures. This grin was called the archaic smile and was used at all times, even when inappropriate, such as the face of a dying figure. The purpose of this smile was to add a sense of life. These figures represented life, confidence, and pride. These statues are different from the Egyptians because they are free from the stone block. The Greeks were interested in movement, just haven't perfected it yet, and the statues are nude because of the interest in the human body. The Anavos kouros was an example of an archaic kouros. Intended as a grave marker to memorialize a boy that died in battle, he was not a portrait. These sculptures replaced the craters. More emphasis was placed on illustrating the body than the facial features. This is a late example of a kouros and shows just how far the Greeks had come in their understanding of the human body. He is round and proportionate and realistically defined muscle structure. Although they borrowed the stiff striding position of the Egyptians, the Greeks added that smile. It's different because it's nude and it's free from the block. The second type of figure was the kore. The kore was fully clothed female standing with her feet together. Her body forms a cylindrical shape. Much attention was paid to the hairstyles, clothing, and jewelry of these kore figures. They also wore the archaic smile. The peplos kore was one such figure named for the traditional garment, the peplos, that she wore. This figure is simple in form and is characteristic of the Doric figures made on the mainland of Greece. It is 4 feet high. Ionic kore figures made on the coast of Asia Minor were much more ornate and decorative in form. The chios kore is an example of an Ionic kore, much more elaborate and intricate pattern of costume and hair. Archaic kore and kouros, although much more proportionate and muscular, were still not lifelike. They were limited by their unrealistic smile and stiff position. One thing that usually blows students' minds is that Greek sculpture wasn't the pure white marble that we are used to thinking of them as. In fact, Greek sculptures were full color. Doesn't this really change how you look at these sculptures?